On the last episodes of the Evolution of Hyrule, we tackled the Unified Timeline, Downfall Timeline, and Child Timeline. That is 3 down, 1 to go. All that remains based on the most recent official Zelda timeline published in Hyrule Historia is the adult branch, which in my opinion is the most logical, consistent one of the whole bunch. No retcons, no old or obscure installments from times before Nintendo even considered a timeline on this scale, and no weird inclusions which don't seem to belong. The adult timeline is perfect. 3 consecutive games which all follow up on each other without complicating things. Whether or not you actually like every installment is a different story, but it's hard to deny that this is the only timeline where the events are crystal clear, and it actually feels like Nintendo had a roadmap in mind. Again, like the previous episodes, I recommend you watch part 1 first, as that one explains everything up until Ocarina of Time, which, like the other branches, the adult timeline follows up on. So with that said, let's get back to business. The first candidate on the list is the game which got a lot of criticism upon its announcement, only to quickly win over the hearts of fans and critics alike: The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. The events of this game take place hundreds of years after the events of Ocarina of Time. However, unlike the Child timeline, there is no holiday trip to Termina, no ventures or personal journeys outside Hyrule, and that is because, in this reality, the hero of time doesn't exist. The Wind Waker follows up on the future events of Ocarina of Time. That is to say, after Ganon was sealed by the sages, an adult Princess Zelda sends Link back in time to relive his childhood, essentially erasing him from existence. In between Ocarina of Time and The Wind Waker, an event took place which doesn't really have a name, and is also not listed on the official timeline. I've just decided to name it as it is, and that is Ganondorf's second invasion. After sending the hero of time back in time, adult Zelda stayed behind, and Hyrule, now without a hero and with Ganon sealed inside the Sacred Realm, started rebuilding and recovering from the devastation left behind after Ganondorf's tyrannical rule. As the only surviving member of the royal family, Princess Zelda is crowned and becomes queen, is married and eventually has offspring, thus re-establishing the royal family of Hyrule. This time of peace was short-lived, however, as it wasn't long until Ganondorf somehow managed to break free from the Sacred Realm. And similar to the Child timeline, despite being sealed for all these countless years, he is still in possession of the Triforce of Power. Zelda still holds the Triforce of Wisdom, and since the Hero of Time ceased to exist, the Triforce of Courage has been split into pieces and hidden across the kingdom, its whereabouts unknown. Ganondorf once again set his eyes on obtaining the full relic, starting with the Piece of Wisdom, and came eerily close to his goal. Together with his army, he invaded the capital and was literally at the kingdom's doorstep when, after a desperate plea for help from Hyrule's people, none other than the gods themselves suddenly decided to interfere. After instructing Hyrule's populace to flee to the mountaintops, Hyrule's creators let loose a torrential downpour, flooding the kingdom beneath a giant body of water, later known as the Great Sea. This event is also known as the Great Flood. King Daphne's no hands in Hyrule, Ganondorf and his army remained beneath the waves, sealed inside a bubble at the bottom of the Great Sea, and due to the power of the Master Sword, even frozen in time. Among those fleeing to the mountains was Princess Zelda, along with her royal caretakers. And as you can see from this painting hanging inside Hyrule Castle, are the literal ancestors of what will later be Tetra and her crew of pirates. Man, genes sure are a powerful thing in this universe. Hundreds of years pass by since the Great Flood, and the events of the Wind Waker sees the ever-so-persistent Ganondorf once again break free as he makes his way to the world above the waves to continue his hunt for the Triforce, which now lies partially in the hands of Tetra, who again is Zelda's ancestor, and partially in the hands of the King of Hyrule. And as mentioned before, the Triforce of Power still belongs to Ganondorf, and the Triforce of Courage is still in pieces and lies hidden around Hyrule. Similar to the Downfall and Child timeline, we will use Ocarina of Time's map of Hyrule as a source for comparison, since this is how we last saw the kingdom before the timeline split into 3. Obviously, as far as changes go, well, the entire kingdom has flooded. All that remains of the once prosperous kingdom are the peaks of the highest mountains, which now serve as small islands where the descendants of Hyrule's inhabitants have lived their lives in the centuries since. Let's take a look at Hyrules Races first this time, as this will come in handy once we start dissecting the lay of the land. Obviously we have the Hylians, which as stated before are the distant descendants of the people who once lived in Hyrule before disaster struck. As far as settlements go, the large majority of them live on Windfall Island, which is now kinda like the new capital, and the smaller group are living on Outset Island, which is also where Link and his family grew up. These Hylians live a more simple life as farmers and fishermen, whereas on Windfall we see more use of technology, such as a giant windmill which doubles as a lighthouse, alchemy, photography, and explosives. Then we have the Rito, which are confirmed to be the descendants of the Zora, at least in this timeline. Now, you might be asking yourself the very logical question of why on earth would an aquatic race like the Zora evolve into birds when there's literally water everywhere now? Shouldn't this be paradise for them? And the simple answer is that unlike the Zora from Termina, which are clearly saltwater based, since they live in and around an ocean, the ones from Ocarina of Time are in all probability used to a freshwater environment. They live in and around a big river after all, and Ocarina of Time's Hyrule features no oceans. Now, maybe the Zora can adapt to other water types, but that would require time to adjust. Clearly a giant rapid flood is too big and sudden of a change and would give them no time to adapt. However, we have seen them being able to live on land for extended periods of time. Relative to Zora's domain, Death Mountain would have been the closest peak, so they fled from the domain to the volcano and with the help of the dragon spirit Valu evolved into the Rito. The Gorons are almost entirely gone. As beings made up of pure rock, obviously they aren't exactly made for surviving in the water, as they would immediately sink to the bottom and drown. However, there is still a small number of them traveling the seas as merchants, but there's no Goron capital to be found anywhere. It could be that there are more of them who survived the flood and are now living somewhere else, but we'll get into that later. Next we have the Koroks, who are shown to be the pure and true form of the forest spirits formerly known as the Kokiri in Ocarina of Time. They have continued to live with the Great Deku Tree, who is confirmed to be the very same Deku Tree as the Sprout we saw in Ocarina of Time after beating the Forest Temple. The reason we know this is because he initially mistakes this Link for the Hero of Time, who, as mentioned earlier, no longer exists in this timeline. And lastly, we have the Gerudo. Well, one of them anyway. As far as we know, nothing remains of Ganondorf's people. They are never seen in this timeline and must mean that they were either exiled after Ganondorf was sealed, were wiped out during Ganondorf's second invasion, or maybe were not able to make it to the mountains in time to escape the Great Flood. With that said, it's time to look at the map. Now, obviously, the large majority of Hyrule is no longer visible, with it being underwater and all. And we don't even know how far the Great Sea spans outside the borders of Ocarina of Time's map, but we can still look at a few individual islands and make some estimates. Now, the sheer amount of islands we see here might seem surprising, but Hyrule has always been a very mountainous land. Just look at the landscape of Twilight Princess as an example, and you can see just how many mountains surround the kingdom. In almost every direction, mountains and large hills can be seen in the distance. To get some proper orientation, let's start with Hyrule's former capital, which lies here, directly below the Tower of the Gods. Though it bears little to no resemblance to the castle we saw in Ocarina of Time, I do believe that this might still be the same location. The way the castle stands on this rock formation with only one bridge leading in and out strikes a strong resemblance to the way Ganon's castle was built, which of course collapsed in on itself at the end of the game. So it could be that the Hylians rebuilt the castle on top of the remains. An alternative would be that they moved the castle to Lake Hylia, since, as we can see, the castle is surrounded by a giant lake connected to a river. And as we can see, Lake Hylia did have a small island in the middle of it. We can also see Ganon's tower in the distance and is actually relatively close by, and by the looks of it could be on the edge of Gerudo Valley or even inside the desert itself. The bridge leading to the tower crosses this canyon, very similar to the Gerudo Canyon found in Ocarina of Time. More interestingly, if we go out of bounds in the final battle arena where we fight Ganondorf, we can see that the tower is surrounded by desert. Of course, this is something we wouldn't be able to see during the fight itself, but this proves that the Gerudo Desert does still exist, and is where Ganondorf built his new tower preceding his second invasion. Furthermore, we see no trace of the Temple of Time anywhere in this timeline. Instead, the Master Sword now resides in a secret chamber in the basement of the castle, hidden underneath a statue honoring the Hero of Time, likely built under the command of Zelda after she sent him back in time to commemorate all he had done for the kingdom. We do find a set of ruins to the southeast of the castle, approximately where the Temple of Time would have been if we were to assume that the castle was built on top of the remains of Ganon's castle. So could these be the remains of the holy site, and these other ruins in front of the castle the remnants of Castle Town? It's hard to say for sure, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. Regardless, the Temple of Time is obviously no longer around. Either the Hylians took it down after Ganondorf was sealed in order to get rid of the entrance to the Sacred Realm, which the temple originally was, or it may have been destroyed during Ganon's second invasion, after he broke free from the Sacred Realm. Whatever the case may be, the Master Sword had long since been moved to the secret room in the castle's basement, and King Daphnis even comments on how Ganondorf never even knew about the existence of this chamber, so moving the sword here seems to have been the right call. Aside from being the new resting place of the legendary blade, the chamber also serves as sort of a memorial to the events of Ocarina of Time. It even depicts the original 6 sages on the stained glass windows. Now that we know where the original capital lies, we can start looking at some of the islands and see if we can find some original landmarks in the world above. I won't be covering every island, of course, as we would be here all week. Besides, most islands are clearly just random, previously unnamed mountain peaks and nothing more. Nothing we could cross-reference with Ocarina of Time's map. But when we compare the map of the Wind Waker to Ocarina, we do see some familiar faces. Death Mountain has always been to the northeast of the castle, and on the Great Sea, northeast of the Tower of the Gods, we find Dragon Roost Island here. It goes without saying that this is most likely the very same volcano. Death Mountain has historically always been the highest peak in Hyrule, and here too it stands as the tallest island around, aside from the Tower of the Gods, though that one is clearly man-made. We do see one additional volcanic island, but this one is very small and so close to Dragon Roost that it is likely an extension of the Death Mountain region. Ever since Skyward Sword, we've seen that there are other peaks surrounding the volcano which also spew out smoke or even lava. So the location definitely matches in relation to the castle. The name change to Dragon Roost Island is also quite logical, since we already established in part 1 that the name Death Mountain was given to the volcano by the Gorons, who for many millennia after Skyward Sword made their home here. After the flood, the Gorons disappeared from the volcano, and now the Rito, formerly known as the Zora, have been living here for the past centuries alongside their dragon deity, so they simply renamed it to Dragon Roost. Windfall Island is an interesting one. It shares a similar soundtrack as Kakariko Village, but it's obvious that the two villages are not the same. Kakariko would have been located here, close to Death Mountain. However, it is possible that the inhabitants of Windfall are descendants of the people from Kakariko. The only thing that doesn't make sense is the location. Since the village was so close to Death Mountain, you would think that this was the most logical escape option when the Great Flood happened. Of course, we don't know how much time the people of Hyrule were given to evacuate before the water started rising, but perhaps the volcanic environment of Death Mountain was simply too dangerous and uninhabitable for the Hylians of Kakariko, and instead they set off to a different mountain to the northwest of the capital. Alternatively, maybe they did initially flee to Death Mountain, but again, since the environment wasn't suitable, they later sailed from Dragon Roost to Windfall and established their new town here. Kakariko has historically been tied to the Sheikah. In Ocarina of Time, it was originally a Sheikah village built by them, but because most of them were wiped out during the Hyrulean Civil War, the village became predominantly occupied by Hylians. And although the Sheikah are completely gone in this timeline and are never seen again, we do find one clue of their heritage on Windfall. Mrs. Mary, the teacher on Windfall, has what seems like a stylistic depiction of a Sheikah eye on her outfit. This could mean that one or more inhabitants of Windfall have Sheikah ancestry, or at the very least that a part of their culture was preserved by the Hylians who fled to Windfall, since the Sheikah were already close to extinct in Ocarina of Time. So in a way, Windfall and Kakariko could actually be connected in terms of their culture and ancestry, but geologically they are completely separate from one another. Next we have the Forest Haven, which matches with the location the Kokiri Forest and Lost Woods would have been located in relative to Hyrule's capital in Ocarina of Time. That is to say, to the southeast of the castle. It's not exactly clear how the forest and Deku Tree came to exist on this mountain peak, since I don't remember any big mountains in and around the forest in Ocarina of Time, but then again the Deku Tree is a spirit guardian. I guess he could have elevated the land around him or grown a giant wooden cocoon around it. I mean, it is literally a tree within a tree, so anything is possible when spirits are involved. And honestly, that's about it in terms of islands we can use for reference. Obviously, looking for a lake or a river inside an ocean would be impossible, so Lake Hylia and the old Zora's Domain are lost forever. And other places like Lon Lon Ranch and the aforementioned Kakariko Village would have also been completely submerged. And none of them are visible from the underwater Hyrule Castle either. But if Hyrule Castle was indeed still in the same general area as it was in Ocarina of Time, they would have been located somewhere around here. And although we do see the desert in the Out of Bounds section I showed earlier, on the Great Sea we don't really see anything familiar from that province. Though I do find it poetic that Ganondorf's home base on the Great Sea is the Forsaken Fortress, which is approximately where the desert would have been located, to the west of the capital. All the other islands, even the ones which play a pretty big role like Outset and Great Fish Isle, don't seem to have any correlation with anything we would be able to find in Ocarina of Time. As stated before, they would have been located on unnamed or even unseen mountain peaks somewhere. At the end of the Wind Waker, the underwater void which the old Kingdom of Hyrule has resided in for centuries finally collapses in on itself, and the last remains finally washed away and buried beneath the waves, officially ending the existence of the kingdom as we know it. And that wraps up the Wind Waker, and we can finally move on to Phantom Hourglass. We will largely skip over this game since it has little to no relation to Hyrule. The entire adventure takes place in a world called the Realm of the Ocean King. Because I only played this game once, a long time ago, I initially thought this was just a location outside the borders of the Great Sea from the Wind Waker somewhere. But it is actually another parallel dimension, one which Link and Tetra access through a portal while aboard a mysterious ghost ship, while the rest of the crew stays behind. And yes, these are still the same characters from the previous game, and only takes place a short time after the events of the Wind Waker. We know for a fact that this is a parallel world. We can clearly see the portal. Time also moves differently between the two dimensions, since when the duo returns to their own world, they are surprised to hear from the crew that only about 10 minutes has passed for them. I also quickly have to mention the existence of this graph I only recently discovered in Hyrule Encyclopedia. I know the canonicity of Encyclopedia is often questioned. It does provide some very cool tidbits of information, but it also makes some claims which fans have debated or even flat out debunked. This graph also depicts the Realm of the Ocean King as a parallel world, but I do find the chart itself a bit odd. For instance, I have no idea why they chose to categorize these worlds as either parallel worlds or kingdoms, because some can be both after all. Lorule is listed as a kingdom, but it's also clearly a different dimension. We travel to it using rifts or portals. The same thing goes for Labrana, which according to this chart is also a parallel world, but it's also unmistakably a kingdom ruled over by Queen Ambi. I think it would have been better to just classify them as either parallel or non-parallel or something. Oh, and by the way, in part 2 about the downfall timeline, I stated that Labrana and Holodrum are likely on the same physical plane as Hyrule, but apparently they are not. In some ways, this does make sense, seeing as Link is transported here by the Triforce, but it also raises some questions considering that Zelda and her nursemaid Impa visit these worlds as well, either before or after Link arrives there. I don't know, maybe portal travel is just everyday business in Hyrule, but I digress. The Realm of the Ocean King is structured very similar to that of the Great Sea, a vast body of water with small islands scattered across. Hence my initial confusion that this was on the same physical plane. In terms of races, we once again find the Hylians like Lineback and Jolene, the Anuki, a brand new Eskimo or Inuit type of race, the Yuk, also new to the series and who are on bad terms with the Anuki due to a misunderstanding, and interestingly enough, the Gorons who have their own island here. It's not clear if these are related to the Gorons from Ocarina of Time or the few merchants we saw in the Wind Waker, but if they are, it could be that the majority of them fled to this dimension during or after the Great Flood. Not that this dimension is any better, I mean it's still a vast ocean, but oh well. Other than that, there isn't really much to say, as again, this land has nothing to do with Hyrule or even the land surrounding it. It exists on a separate plane of existence. It has its own locations and even its own deity who watches over the land, a giant whale called Oceus, who has a lot in common with the Windfish from Link's Awakening and I believe belongs to the same type of Leviathan deities. Last up we have Spirit Tracks. Again, this game doesn't take place in Hyrule. Well, technically anyway. Keep in mind, at the end of the Wind Waker the kingdom was submerged for good. However, the islands above the water still exist, so technically Hyrule isn't completely gone. The kingdom is, but places like Outset, Windfall, Forest Haven and Dragon Roost are still there. However, Spirit Tracks takes place on a completely new continent, one that already existed for who knows how long. At some point in time, Link, Tetra and the crew discovered this new continent and their descendants would go on to establish an entirely new kingdom. This kingdom is often referred to as New Hyrule, but other than the bloodline of Princess Zelda, it has no relation to the original Hyrule whatsoever. The continent itself isn't even called Hyrule, only the kingdom does. The land is actually referred to as the Land of Spirits of Good. It even has its own history of events preceding the time when the Hylians first landed here and established their kingdom, like the battle between the spirit beings beings known as the Locomo and the ancient demon by the name of Malladus. Although many characters we see in Spirit Tracks have some very strong resemblances to those from the Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass, Nico is actually the only original founder of New Hyrule who is still alive as far as we know. Everyone else, including Link and Zelda, are descendants. Seeing as how this is a completely new continent, it has very little impact on the history of the Kingdom of Hyrule. In fact, since this is the last game, it actually marks the end of its history. An old kingdom replaced by a brand new one in faraway lands. We do see some of those good old Hylian naming traditions pop up once again though. We have the obvious ones like Hyrule Castle and Hyrule Field, but also the Lost Woods and Kokiri Village. There's no Lake Hylia, and although there is a volcano, it isn't called Death Mountain. What we do find aside from the Hylians are Gorons, who have apparently also managed to make their way to this new continent at some point. Or already lived here before? I don't know. We do find Zora as well, though these are the hostile kind akin to the ones we saw in A Link to the Past, so probably not related to the Rito from the Wind Waker in any way. The Anuki also make a return in this game, and lastly we have the Locomo, who are more or less divine beings similar to the sages. And yeah, that pretty much sums up Spirit Tracks. As I said at the beginning of the video, the adult timeline feels like the most consistent and well-constructed sequence of events. 3 adventures which all follow up on one another in a way that makes sense chronologically. A continuous voyage that starts off with an ancient legendary kingdom on its last legs and is finally wiped from existence when its purpose is fulfilled. In the end, we see our heroes set sail towards the horizon and unknown lands in hopes of finding a new future. Phantom Hourglass serves as sort of a side adventure, an unknown world in peril which they happen to stumble upon on their travels. After saving this world, the same heroes continue their search, until after years of traversing the vast seas, they finally find a new continent where they establish a new kingdom where their descendants will live on. And to pay homage to their lineage, they continue the naming tradition of Hyrule to pay tribute to the land which they once originated from. It actually feels planned. Each game picks up where the other one left off. We even hear a train whistle and the sound of wheels on a track at the end of Phantom Hourglass, proving that they already knew and hinted at what the next installment was going to be. And with that, we have reached the end of the evolution of Hyrule. For now at least. I will eventually do one final episode on Breath of the Wild Hyrule, however it feels best if we wait until after Breath of the Wild 2 has come and gone. As of right now, we don't even know where Breath of the Wild falls on the timeline, hence we have nothing to compare it to. We don't even know which version of Hyrule preceded this Hyrule, or if it will even get a definitive placement, but the sequel could potentially provide more information or even totally explain everything. So until then, I will keep this series on hold for the time being. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Hyrule's history and geography, and thank you for joining me on this journey. And finally, a big thanks to all of my amazing Patreon supporters and channel members. We have 2 new faces joining the maze, so say hello to LuxPro and Kyle. Thank you both so much for your generosity. You guys are the best. And that wraps up the video. I will see you in the next one. This is Don signing off, and have a good one.